So we went over Wise. So now we're going to go over pretty much everybody else. This is kind of why I don't necessarily marry training like programs like block scheduling, all this other stuff, because I just understand that we need to correct movement before we have to movement should become correcting movement should be primary to anything else. And realistically, by time we correct movement, it's already, there's no point to even do any other types of, crazy training methods, because it's nearly impossible to fix movement perfectly. So we just try to get them in the right direction. So what we're going to go over now is just pretty much everybody else, and what I see and what I'm doing with them, and how it's going to ultimately lead to healthier and better results. So let's go over Tim right now. So we're going to go, I'm not too sure what video this is.
Go.
Okay, so this is shoulder flexion. So let's take a look at it from just the overall static posture perspective. So just like the PRI concepts, right shoulder's lower. You can see how his pants even kind of dictate that. What feels normal for him is sitting into that right hip. His left pant is left side's a little bit higher than his right. You can see how when I ask him to kind of set his arms by his side, he bunches up his rhomboids and his mid traps kind of bunch up, and he's very retraction dominant. You can actually see how he's not actually kyphotic, but and better yet, he's really, really flat spine, but he also has kind of like a slant to it. You can see how it's kind of shifted a little bit, like more or less falling to the right. So that's, again, it's probably problematic. Could lead to injuries, could lead to decrease in velocity, all that good stuff. So let's just take a look at see what's happens here, and we'll talk about it when we're done.
Yeah.
All right. So from an overhead perspective, like I was mentioning to you before, Tim is a very stiff individual, so he actually lacks mobility because he lacks tissue length. So his lats are really tight. Can't get his arms all the way overhead. His hands are still internally rotated slightly as he goes overhead. Arms aren't straight. Doesn't get good full shoulder flexion. There's no upward rotation components there. There's no really protraction. The serratus don't fire. And then there's just a bunch of space difference between the right and the left. It's just, look how much that ball moves in the socket, and the scapula doesn't rotate up with it. Then you can also see how he's another one that has poor eccentric control on the way down. And again, that's not good because that's him releasing the ball and trying to slow his arm down. Right? So you can see how that right one pretty much just does whatever it wants to. It doesn't really have good stability in the lower trap and maybe the mid trap to kind of pull itself down a little bit. So we're going to look at horizontal abduction. Let me just slide this up here so I don't look at it again. So this is horizontal abduction. Oh, no, I guess not. That's odd. Oh, it's 03 twice. Huh. Alright, well, we'll come back to that. Why don't we go to... we'll go to Olson's static picture. I got a picture of him. So you can see how he's very retraction dominant, almost like he starts in a military posture. Left rib is a little bit more predominant than his right. You can see how it kind of stands out a little bit. Very, very low clavicle, so lives in a bunch of scapular depression, downward rotation. So you live in scapular depression, downward rotation, you expect to get your arms overhead, you're going to have some serious trouble doing that. It's going to be problematic. You're going to impinge on the rotator on the cuff. There's a lot of stuff going on here. Right arm's more internally rotated pronated than his left arm is. These shows as he's military, but deep down inside, there's way more stuff going on in there than we actually see from the outside. That's where it's important to kind of take a feel and see what's going on with the overall bigger picture, and then go from there. So we're going to say, let's go look over his stuff right now. I think this is him, and I think this is him. What? All right. No. All right. All right, let's go. Quick time. Cool. All right, so this is Olsen. Horizontal abduction. So basically, what his arm does when he first brings out his glove.
Oh yeah.
So this is very poor upward rotation. Doesn't get anywhere near where he needs to be. You can see how he starts with, again, downward rotation. That spine is very, very flat. You can see from the shadow how it actually, again, kind of curves to the right. So he's just so far stuck in that right side, and he can't get his arms overhead because those lats are pulling him to a gross amount of extension.
Face the other one. Good.
Let's see where he starts. So look at that. So he starts with his arms pretty much behind his body. Forward head posture. He's really bad. He's got a crap ton of forward head posture. He's actually really, really flat through here. He's compensating through a bunch of neck-related issues. You take a look at his vision. His vision's kind of oriented up because he lives in a bunch of extensions to the back of his neck. Overhead, take a look at how much lumbar extension he's got. Crazy amount of anterior pelvic tilt. Look at kind of how that pelvis is dumped forward. Again, not good. Can't get his arms overhead all the way. Those lats are really taking over.
True.
That's Olsen. That's again. So he's another one that's just very retraction dominant. Probably is not going to really benefit that much from pulling exercises, where pushing pushing and reaching exercises are going to get him to more optimal level. Let's see who this is. This is Colin. Let's look at Colin. I want to show you something funny with Colin. This is what Pure Eye does. It's pretty magical. All right, so we're going to look at Colin. So Colin's another one where he's just got a crap ton of flat T-spine, lumbar extension, really. When I asked him to bring his arms overhead, his arms start, pretty much flexed. Bunch of elbow flexion here. He's, probably 135 at 135 degrees of elbow flexion. That bicep's really, really tight. And look how much anterior humeral glide he's going into. So that bicep's pretty much, tearing the ball out of the socket right here. It's pretty nuts. I'm sure he, labrum issues, definitely shoulder issues. So that's where he's at right now, and why, he's not where he's at. We're gonna be.
As far back. Yep.
Yeah, so he's another one. There's a bunch of compensation there. He's a very, very intelligent kid. You can hear out what he asked for. And just take a look at that overhead. We're gonna move this down, but there's a bunch of extension to his lumbar spine and his T-spine. Obviously, you need your T-spine to get overhead, to extend to get overhead. But now take a look at the position of his arm. So he feels like he's overhead, but if you really take a look at where his spine should be, he lacks a good amount of shoulder flexion. If I made, I don't even know if I could draw on this, but if I made a line from where his hip should be, so if he was straight up and down, getting his arms completely overhead, he'd pretty much, with this rib cage being pushed back down, this pelvis being realigned, put him more optimal way. He's basically at 135 degrees of shoulder flexion. We need to get 180, so he's going to compensate somewhere, probably through his lower back, to get him to throw a baseball, which again is not good.
Oh, there's so many injuries. Yeah.
Do me a favor.
Yeah.
When you get on a computer,
Okay.
just go from there.
And then download now. This is shoulder abduction. So same thing. Look, starts with arms by his side and a bunch of retraction. Rowing is not going to be good for him. He already has over-dominated rhomboids and mid-traps, and look how big those upper traps are. That's disgusting. Oh my God, that's.
So first off,
Look how flat his T-spine is. He's very, very flat. He's again kind of tilted to the right. Arms, shoulder blades don't get all the way up overhead. They probably stop moving. Ball is definitely not on the socket the way we want it to be. Right upper trap doesn't elevate like near his left upper trap, but you can see how his right shoulder is still lower.
now once you go into
Good eccentric control, but just has no idea how to look at how they pinch together. Look how retraction dominant he is. That's when he picks his arm, out of his glove, and his that scapula rides towards the middle of his body. That anterior part of the humerus kind of rolls forward. It's basically coming out of the socket. This is not good. It's going to lead to a bunch of injuries and a bunch of poor throws and just lack of control.
Close.
So now these are pretty cool, but this is what PRI does. So I want to show you we'll take a look at each video, and then we'll go side by side. Excuse me. We'll go side by side. We'll kind of compare, contrast. Let's see, 5-6 and 5-7. All right, so we're gonna take a look at standing rotation. I'm seeing if he can actually internally rotate into his hip, and if he can, does he have any restrictions? Does he get the full, 50 degrees of rotation to his hips that we need? So you can see how the guy's double rotating into his right hip and rotating into his left hip. So you can take a look. So we're going to take a look at this. You see where the left pocket's facing. You can barely see it. So I gave him one breathing exercise to do, one PRI exercise to do, and we're going to see how it impacted his rotation. Again, I gave him the capacity to do it. PRI gives you the capacity to feel. It gives you the capacity to understand, but it doesn't give you the strength to hold and understand that position forever. So you got to own that position. So let's see how a little bit more thoracic rotation. You can see his neck clears up a little bit, and then let's take a look from the left side. Yeah, so take a look at that. So let's take a look at these positions, right? Look how nuts that is. Let's see if he can even rotate more. So that's his finished position. Take a look at how much farther he could rotate, right? So all I did was give him the capacity to rotate into his left hip. Now this is something where I gave Robbie one exercise of learning how to rotate into his left hip, and instead of having a lower back issue, he actually learned how to stay healthy because it just finished the kinetic chain. So this is why it's so important to train good movement patterns and really understand what we're feeling compared to just saying, hey, let's do something that might not help them get into their hips and finish the kinetic chain. So look at how much rotation more he gets on the right compared to the left, and that's just after one breathing exercise. Thought that was pretty cool. So we got a few more. Let's go over Winkler's, because Winkler's a good one. I was thinking about him a lot today. I'm always thinking about this stuff. It's pretty wild how the human body works and how it pretty much does whatever the heck it wants to do. Just a throw, and fixing these movement patterns makes everything better. Sorry, I don't know why this isn't opening. There we go. All right. So Winkler is another kid that was in the crap ton of sway back position. I'll show you from the side view. But from here, you can just take a look at. He's actually very, very anteriorly tilted. He just has really, really big mid traps that kind of hide that. But you can see how he lacks a crap ton of lower trap, posterior tilt. Let's see what he does.
Ready?
Retraction dominant. So the first thing he does when he brings the arm over the head is pinch his scapula together. So again, that's not good.
One more time.
Not finished, so you can see how his scapula doesn't even ride up with his arms. His arms keep moving. His scapula kind of stops, and his arms keep moving. So again, it's not good. So he's retraction dominant. So basically the way that Eric explained that was, again, obviously, I talked about more of like the position of the shoulder. So if the scapula rides back too far, the ball's going to migrate anteriorly out of the socket, which is going to lead to a crap ton of issues. But Eric was explaining that it's basically like saying, hey, we're going to race to get to the finish line. So I'm gonna try to get my arm overhead as fast as I can. But before I want to start, so we're gonna both start at the starting line. You're gonna say go. You're gonna run forward. I'm gonna run 5 yards back, and I'm gonna go forward and try to catch you up. So this kid, they're just losing. They're losing energy. They're losing good control. The kinematics of them throwing is getting all jacked up simply because they're in this retraction dominant position. So let's take a look at his shoulder flexion, I believe this is now. And you can even see how far he lives into lumbar extension. And, he might present as, a thoracic flexion case, but he's actually super flat T-spine too, and that's why he lives in a crazy amount of sway back. Look at his knees. He actually lives in a bunch of hyperextension everywhere. These kids are very, very loose jointed, and they just fall. But take a look at, same thing with him. So, this guy's zone of apposition is so far off that he thinks his arm overhead. Actually, he doesn't even get his arms overhead. If you were to straighten out his upper back as well, and he's in a bunch of forward head posture, ribs flare up, That arms overhead, and they're completely, again, same thing, look like 130 degrees. They actually look less than Collins. So, it's again, that's not good. This is a kid that needs to be able to release the ball out front of himself, and he's so far behind himself right now because of the position that his spine's in that he can't do it. This is a kid that told me, he was starting to lose confidence in everything because he just believed that everything he was doing was guiding him in the right direction, but every time he would go to throw, he'd have worse and worse results. So, this is a kid that, doing stuff the right way and teaching his body how to move a little bit better, teaching him how to reach compared to, pulling and teaching him how to use
his cups on your lap.
Cool. So look where he starts too. So he starts with, his humerus kind of migrating anteriorly, a bunch of lower trap instability. You can see how he lacks posterior tilt, a bunch of sway back is just a recipe for disaster. We got 2 more here. I don't even know who these are. This might be Wise. Yes, Wise. We're good here. So we got 1 more. We got Foster. All right. Let's see. All right. So retraction dominant as well. Not bad upward rotation. Even though he thinks he's got eccentric control and he's slowing his arms down, he actually lacks eccentric control in his left scapula. Take a look at how it kind of just wings out there, right? So again, these kids are smart, but they don't really understand what it is to feel. Can't really get his arms overhead either there. It's just his scapula stops moving. Let's see if we can slow it down. Right. And look how big that posterior delt is, because that cuff probably isn't fire as much as he wants it to. Nice hair. So you take a look at Foster, and this is a kid that we know lacks a crap ton of internal rotation everywhere. Well, we can see why. He's super flat. His pelvis is dipped forward. I want to actually get his assessment sheet real quick. Let's see what's really it's always better to assess than guess. So, I just wrote his program, so it must be hidden. Alright, so here's what I wrote for Foster. Let's see. Meaty upper traps, bunch of anterior tilt and downward rotation. UCL when he was 12 years old, right hip feels tight, right lower back feels tight, shoulder blades feel tight, hamstrings feel tight. So this is a guy that, with his symptoms, we know just isn't a bunch of extension. He's holding on for dear life. Look at his body. So look at how anteriorly tilted and anteriorly migrated that scapula and that ball is kind of riding forward. I had a brain fart there. The ball of the humerus is riding forward, but you could just see it's just if you don't start in a good position, you're probably not going to get to a good position. We know that he lacks internal rotation. We know that in his hips. Look at the position that his hips start in. So he's in anterior pelvic tilt. His hips are dumped forward. He's running out of space in his hips because the ball is sitting in a socket differently, just because of what's going on there. The only thing that was really tight on him was his quads, but again, we know that when your quads get tight and your hamstrings get tight, it's because you're posteriorly or you're anteriorly tilted. When he lifted his arms overhead during shoulder, so during the other one where we saw from the back, he said his lower back actually bothered him, which is really weird for the concept of he had nothing but his arms overhead. But I mean, his arms could go overhead, and he throws and it bothers him too. I don't, that's something that he said. But without a baseball is definitely weird. Is another kid that couldn't squat. Oh, actually, he could squat. Sorry. Him and Tim could squat. Out of the other guys that couldn't get into a good squat position, I want to say my brother couldn't. That's maybe not a Richmond player. Colin could get into a deep squat. Brendan could. Wise could. Olsen could not. And Winkler could. So all these kids can get into a deep squat position, but none of them can really control it. So let's see what's going on here. So a bunch of compensation through that rib cage and that lower back. You see how it moves there. You see how there was. Take a look at that. Take a look at how subtle it is, but you can see how it moves, right? So again, now he's got the baseball overhead and he's being more aggressive with it, and it's way more than just subtle. Can get his arms overhead pretty good. Head neck moves a little bit forward. Ribs flare up a little bit. So, but just look at where he starts. So he starts in a bunch of anterior tilt and anterior humeral glide. Like that's probably not it's not good. Where is his thing at? It's a kid that's 6'2", 205 and only throws 85. Well, you can see why. Starting draft, not bad shoulder strength. And he couldn't rotate either. Yeah, I mean, that's pretty much it. I'm going to send you everything now. Just keep me updated with what you think.